Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon or this lunch. Make sure you get food and drinks. My name is Emily Garrigo-Kempton. I work for the Center for Advanced Genocide Research at the USC Shoah Foundation. And on behalf of all our staff, I'd like to welcome you today. It is my great pleasure to welcome, or to introduce you to Paula Cuellar Cuellar, who is our 2016-2017 Center Fellow. As you may know, we have many different fellowships, and even I get lost in all the different fellowships we offer. So if you are, as a researcher, interested in applying for our fellowships, you should check them out. So Paula is our research fellow for this summer, and she's just today finishing a residency, and she has spent 1 month looking at our most recent collection of testimonies from Guatemala. Some of you may know we have a new collection of Guatemalan testimonies. About 10 have been indexed so far, but because Paula, because she came to the USC Shoah Foundation, she was able to access many more that are still in the process of being indexed. So she's going to talk to us about that research. And to give you a little bit more background about Paula, I actually need to read because she's so accomplished that I can't actually memorize all of her achievements. So forgive me for actually using a paper. But so Paula came to us from the University of Minnesota, where she's currently a PhD candidate in history with a minor in human rights. She holds a LLB degree from Central American University, which is where?
In El Salvador.
In El Salvador, thank you so much. And a master's degree in human rights and education for peace from the University of El Salvador as well. She also has, that's why I really need the paper, a postgraduate degree in law and international human rights law from Notre Dame, and a postgraduate diploma in human rights and democratization process from the University of Chile. So today she will talk about the use of the testimonies and Scorched's policies in Guatemala and El Salvador. Please welcome.
Thank you very much. Well, I have to start the presentation by saying that I'm a lawyer, so I have a lot of respect for the law, but I'm also a historian in the making. So that's why you'll see that my problem with the legal definition of genocide, and it can change a little bit because sometimes law doesn't adjust quickly to the historic demands of the society. So I think that's one of the problems of the legal definition of genocide, but we will talk about this a little bit later. The other thing that I would like to clarify is that you may see a different topic than the one that it was advertised. So you might be wondering why. It's just El Salvador. So the thing is that I have been here researching for a month, but I haven't been able to process all the testimonies that I have been listening to. So I will just take a few of them of Guatemalan example to show kind of similarities with the Scorched operations in El Salvador, and then I will refer in depth to the case of El Salvador. But then when you are asking questions, you can ask me about what were my specific findings with the testimonies, and I'm more than open to talk about them because I think those are really powerful testimonies, but I think that I need to analyze it a little bit more before bringing it into a paper. So part of the presentation I will be kind of reading, and then the other part with the PowerPoint I'll just be talking. So it's just that I don't want to lose some concepts that I would like to tell you about. Well, the first thing I'd like to start with, it's that usually when we think about the origins of the term genocide, we think about Europe. Europe immediately comes to our mind because of the Holocaust, and then we can think think about the Armenian genocide. So this, and it's about the origins, not what were its development afterwards, but when Lemkin coined the term, he was thinking about the Armenian genocide and also about the Holocaust. However, so that this Eurocentric point of view that we have in mind doesn't allow us to look like further and see how Lemkin was also thinking about Latin America when he coined the term of genocide. So specifically in his book, which, well, is an incomplete manuscript that has been just published, part of it, recently, his book, which its name is History of Genocide, Antiquity, Middle Ages, and Modern Times, he talks about the conquest by the Spaniards of Peru, and he calls that a genocide. So we can see that Lemkin was not only interested in Europe as its locus of enunciation, but he was also looking at other parts like Latin America. So my intention is to take away that point of attention in Europe and Africa as well, and take it to Latin America to let you know that there, or to make awareness that there have been genocides perpetrated in modern times in Latin America as well. So my particular intention with this presentation is to debate whether scorched earth operations, and you can help me with your questions or with your comments, I will really appreciate it, whether scorched earth operations conducted as a policy by the state of El Salvador during the 1980s indeed constitute genocidal practices per se, independently of the groups that the groups that are targeted. Because we're talking in El Salvador about disadvantages, social and economic groups. So whether I think it is important, and I will show you afterwards why, I think it is important to discuss whether these crimes are genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes, because it is important to design and draft guarantees of non-repetition for El Salvador and also for Guatemala. In Guatemala, these similar actions of scorched earth operations have been labeled as genocide because they were aimed at the Mayas. However, in El Salvador, these similar practices have not been labeled as genocide because they were aimed basically at poor peasants. It is not that, because basically indigenous people in El Salvador were wiped out in 1932 in what it also constituted a genocide. Around 30,000 people of indigenous descent were killed in approximately a month. So nobody wanted to be considered as an indigenous person after that because that was targeted for murder. So I just would like to ask you first thing if we are, I wanted to say also that although I'm focusing on 2 case studies, which is Guatemala and El Salvador, the results of this research, I want you to go further than that. And for example, thinking about Cambodia, although the Khmer Rouge was responsible for the killing of more than 1 million people, the charges of genocide have just covered those who were not ethnically Khmer. So those who have been deemed as victims of genocides are only Vietnamese, Chinese, Thais, as well as religious groups such as Buddhists, Christians, and Muslims, at least legally. But the rest of the population who was murdered who were ethnically Khmer had not been labeled as victims of a genocide. This is because the Genocide Convention is really narrow in its definition about the groups that are being protected, which are national, ethnical, racial, and religious. So before I continue, I just want to be clear that if we're all in the same page, what scorched earth policies constitute, if we all know what this is. So I'm going to read a little definition on what scorched policies are. So they constitute a deliberate strategy of eliminating or terrifying the peasant population in areas where the enemies are active. The purpose being to deprive them of this source of supply and information and of the possibility of hiding or concealing themselves among the population. In other words, scorched strategies consist of the indiscriminate annihilation of one or several villages during one single operation, followed by destroying or setting fire to the crops, homes, and possession of the victims who have previously been executed or who have fled the area. So scorched earth operations are not only looking to kill the people per se, but to annihilate their means of living. So, which, if we go to the original definition of Lemkin, that was its aim of saying that it was the destruction of social groups. What scorched earth operations do, unlike massacres, is trying to destroy the social fabric of a territory or of a village in order not to allow them to live there anymore. So during the civil war in Guatemala, these scorched earth operations, as I said before, have been labeled as genocide by the Commission for Historical Clarifications because they were aimed at the Maya population. Specifically, what this commission has stated is that agents of the state of Guatemala, within the framework of counterinsurgency operations carried out between 1981 and 1983, committed acts of genocide against groups of Mayan people. So we're saying that, and this policy of scorched earth operation basically is like an expression, it's the outcome of the expression of taking the water from the fish. So what it does is trying to wipe out the population that might be supporting the enemy, which in both cases in El Salvador and Guatemala were the guerrilla forces. These were targeted as the enemies, and thus they wanted to eliminate any way of support of these populations. Just one thing. I'm sorry, but I got. Okay. So I want to bring out to light a couple of phrases that I collected in El Salvador in their testimonies to tell you why they define themselves, or the people that I interview in El Salvador define themselves as victims of scorched earth operations, of operaciones de tierra arrasada. This is not what I have been able to hear in cases of Guatemala. They do not define themselves as victims of scorched earth operations, but of massacres. However, the descriptions in their testimony fit exactly into what a scorched earth operation is. So, for example, I have one phrase from Maria Orbelina Lopez, who said that the armed forces did not want to annihilate only the guerrilla forces or their collaborators. They wanted to physically exterminate us all. And another testimony or another phrase about Mercedes Mendez. She says that since the armed forces could not see us at night, they shot towards the crying children who were in the arms of their mothers with the purpose to murder them all. Finally, Luis Rivas said that the armed forces did not only want to actually kill the people, but they also wanted to destroy our means of survival. They burned our crops, tore down our houses, killed our animals, and bombed our fields. So these testimonies are from Scorched operation, a Scorched operation in El Salvador, which is known as the Massacre of Santa Cruz. And these kinds of testimonies are basically similar to what I heard in the testimonies from Guatemala, in which the army, along with the auto defense patrols, I was just trying to translate it in my mind. So the auto defense patrols came into the town and they didn't interrogate the people before killing them to see if they were guerrilla members or not. Their only aim was to kill the people, not to see if they could get some information. Because whenever they came in, they just bring the people and started killing them with different weapons. For example, machetes or gunfires or different kinds of instruments. And I also want to point out that there were, like, whenever they were in the town, they not only heard the airplanes or the helicopters kept firing at people without indiscrimination. They were not interested in to target someone specifically, so that's why we can see a difference between massacres and scorched earth operations. As one of the scholars was saying in the conference on Guatemala that we had last week, she was saying that she thinks massacres are only one element of scorched earth operations, but it's not what defines or constitutes scorched earth operations per se. So the testimonies that I just read to you and what I have been trying to explain to you from the testimonies that I heard from Guatemala offer a proof of the existence of a deliberate strategy by the armed forces at destroying the social fabric of those economic and social disadvantaged groups or indigenous population. For example, when I was listening to one of the testimonies of Guatemala, it says that one person said that one of the auto defense patrol approached to him and told him, you know what? A seen Indian is a dead Indian. So there was like this intent of destroying a whole social fabric that was built among these people who allegedly were in a support of the guerrilla forces. It was allegedly because, as I'll tell you a little bit later, it was in the mind of the perpetrators that these people were guerrilla forces. So these criminal acts mostly were perpetrated against women, either pregnant or not, children, and seniors, because the men usually have fled the area before because they knew they were going to be targeted because they were deemed as guerrilla supporters or guerrilla members, or the men have been killed before in massacres. For example, in one of the testimonies in Guatemala of Jesus de Osorio, he mentions that there were 3 massacres in Rio Negro, and one of them constitutes a scorched earth operations. However, the 2 previous ones were massacres because they only killed the people. I'm not saying that a massacre should be less, but we can see the difference in these 2 cases. So This scorched earth policy was part, like its roots, we can find its roots in the national security doctrine exercised by most countries of Latin America during the Cold War. So this was not isolated incidents that were just taking place because some people were crazy or because some soldiers did not follow orders or exceeded their authority. It was because this was planned as part of a superior doctrine that was the national security doctrine, which was originated with the genocide, some call them genocide, in Argentina. So this doctrine, as I want to read you the definition, places a priority on protecting the nation as an organic whole. Applied to internal security, this approach negates the importance of individual rights and defines entire classes of people and currents of political opinions as threats to the security of the nation. So the enemy is internal, because the armed forces are supposed to be used for external security, to protect the nation from external threats. But in this case, it was used to protect the nation, or what was conceived as the nation, from the internal enemy, which were the guerrilla forces and communism. So in this under this doctrine, not only the revolutionary movements were deemed as the enemy, but also any other threat against the status quo, such peasant movements, unions movements, or indigenous movements, or religious in this case. So, under this expanded definition of what subversion was, many officers looked askance at any activity that challenged internal stasis or was even remotely connected to the left. It didn't have to be like, people didn't have to be in support of the guerrilla forces per se, or participating in the support of the guerrilla forces, but economic and social demands were seen as a threat to the nation under this expanded definition of the national security doctrine. I would like to focus also in another aspect of genocide that I'm trying to look, and it's genocide and women, and how women in particularly experience these scorched earth operations, which for me, as I told you before, are considered genocidal practices per se. So, during the perpetrations of scorched earth operations, victims were far more likely to be women, children, and seniors. As I already explained, the men usually had fled the area, not to join the guerrilla movements, but because they knew that they were going to be targeted. Or they have been killed previously. In these cases, in which women, children, and seniors were the targets of scorched earth operations, it was usually that women and girls were victims of sexual violence. Indeed, while it's true that men and boys could also be victims of sexual violence, this was not the modus operandi in the cases of Guatemala and El Salvador. At least they were the exception, not the norm. The case of sexual violence against women and girls was the norm, basically. And I can say that not only in scorched earth operations, but also people who were captured in the city and who were subject to torture were also victims of rape. As I was listening to one testimony of Guatemala, Yolanda Aguilar, she was talking about how she was captured in the city while distributing some pamphlets, and she was taken to a headquarters of the police or the security forces, and she was victim of constant rape by the security forces. So sometimes these attacks on the women's body are seen strategically and are politically motivated. Sometimes it's just a form of machismo. But let's say that in this case it had a strategy, which was to terrify the population and to let them know what was coming. So, for example, according to Jenny Lederman, sexual violence may indeed serve many instrumental purposes, but may become an end of its own when it's used for ethnic cleansing or genocide. So, for example, there's this tactic, as we are going to look afterwards in the definition of genocide, that the forced impregnation of women is a technique of, or one of the crimes for genocide. So, and this is because when you analyze the definition of genocide, it does not limit itself to the killing of the people, but it has other different strategies to achieve this crime, such as causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, which can be product of a rape, as well as imposing measures intended to prevent births within a group. For example, I have not heard, neither in El Salvador nor in Guatemala, about this situation which is called traumatic fistula, which was practiced in Africa, in which the penetration from different men was, and it was not only different men but with different objects, it was so terrible that it created a leak between the vagina and the anus. So people couldn't hold their intestines. And this is a practice that has not been seen that I have not heard in these testimonies, but for example, from one of the Guatemalan people, or one of the testimonies that I was listening about Guatemala, about a person who was a victim of the auto defense patrols and of the army along with her wife. She was repeatedly raped in front of him, and then after she was released, she had for years a constant hemorrhage that could not be stopped because the doctor said that something had broken inside her. So she finally ended up dead as a consequence of this rape. And also, rape can also be deemed genocidal because it takes away the economic and moral basis of a community in some cases, because people or women are marginalized after they have been subjected to this form of violence. So, since ancient times, war has been waged by men. However, so rape as part of war was seen as one of the spoils of war. However, just in the last decade of the 20th century, this situation started to change. And then the sexual violence has been contested in courts of law, particularly when dealing with rape as a genocidal practice. So we have the landmark cases of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. Particularly, the case brought before the ICTR against Jean-Paul Akayesu constituted a watershed moment in these types of cases, because The trial chamber 1 of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda concluded that rape and sexual violence indeed constitute genocide in the same way as any other act, as long as they are committed with the specific intent to destroy in whole or in part a particular group. As expressed by that same legal entity, rape and sexual violence certainly constitute inflictions of serious bodily and mental harm to the victims, and even one of the worst ways of inflicting harm of the victim, as he or she suffers both bodily and mental harm. So, and this can also, rape can also be, you know, aimed to disrupt or to impregnate women to end with a particular group. So, for example, according to Jesus de Osorio, and that's one of the things that I heard from the Guatemalan testimonies, whenever the scorched earth operations enter into Rio Negro to perpetrate one scorched earth operation, it actually separated women from men, and women were raped before being killed. So I was thinking that maybe unlike in Bosnia and Herzegovina and those places in which women were being raped to impregnate them with offsprings, in the case of Guatemala, probably that was not their intention, because they were likely killed after they were raped. However, rape was a way to terrorize the populations. And as I was listening to Yolanda Aguilar in her testimony, it was to teach them a lesson of what could happen if they were supporting the guerrilla members. So far, so I will start with the presentation of PowerPoint. So we are kind of going into the second half. Okay. So because I'm going to focus on El Salvador, although I'm going to try to give examples of the testimonies that I heard in Guatemala, I think it's important to introduce you to I'll give you a little background about the armed conflict in El Salvador. So, although the armed conflict in El Salvador started officially in January 10, 1981, with what it was called as the final offensive, it was actually the first offensive of the guerrilla. It became the first offensive. They called it the final offensive because they thought that all the people were going to unite and throw the government, but that did not happen. So, although it started on that day, the causes that launched the conflict date back from long decades of economic and social exclusion of the population, of the closure of spaces for political participation, of violent responses to the social, economic, and political demands by the government, and the absence of the rule of law. For example, although El Salvador was known as the Coffee Republic, that the richness, forgive my English, Spanglish, the profit that they got from this coffee was only concentrated in the hands of what we call in El Salvador the 14 families. These were 14 families who had mostly 90% of the arable lands. So people were living in economic and social exclusions, as I explained before. Racism, unlike in Guatemala, was not an issue because indigenous people have been wiped out in 1932. So, unlike Guatemala, in which discrimination plays a crucial part of the genocide, in El Salvador it was not. Also, there were in 1972, there was an election in El Salvador that was blatantly stolen by the militaries who have been in the government in El Salvador since 1930. So the election was stolen. So in that time, the people saw that they could not hold or conquer the government by pacific means, like the vote. There were also the absence of there were violent responses to the social, economic, and social demands, and also to give you an example of how absent was the rule of law in El Salvador, I interviewed one of the commissioners of the Truth Commission for El Salvador, and he told me that in El Salvador it was not possible to turn in the files to the head of the Supreme Court of Justice or to the president of the Supreme Court of Justice, because after Roberto Dawison, the major figure of the death squad, died, then he took the leadership of the death squad. So the person who was in charge of honoring the rule of law in El Salvador was also the leader of the death squad. So we can see that those institutions who should be in favor to protect the people were actually the ones who were violating their rights. So both in El Salvador and Guatemala, we can say that there were two kinds of violence. It was selective violence aimed at specific people, such as leader of the indigenous, religious, unions, and also there was massive violence. I'm focusing basically on massive violence, which were the targets of scorched earth operations. What the armed conflict left in El Salvador were, like, I'm going to read this really quick, more than 75 extrajudicial killings, more than 8,000 people forcibly disappeared, more than 1 million people fled the country, approximately 28,000 combatants were killed in action, wounded or maimed. This is a figure lower than what happened in Guatemala, which the figure is 200,000 people. And I would like to point out that in both cases, this figure can be underrepresented because we can see that the people who actually filed cases before the Court of Justice, or whose names were recorded at a Truth Commission or by a Truth Commission, were actually people who had some kind of access to the system that was in place. So these figures can actually be underreported. In Guatemala, the Truth Commission from there said that 626 massacres were perpetrated in the country. In El Salvador, just 3 massacres made it to the Truth report, to the final report of the Truth Commission, which is the massacre of El Zumpur, massacre of El Mozote, and massacre of El Calabozo. These have been defined as massacres, but they were indeed scorched earth operations. In the massacre of El Zumpur, approximately 600 people were killed. The village totally was torn apart. In El Mozote, approximately 1,000 people were killed, and in El Calabozo, 300 people. And in all of these cases, they destroyed everything. No way of people reproducing in those spaces. However, there were a lot of scorched earth operations and a lot of massacres, and we do not have a final figure in El Salvador of how many of these acts were perpetrated. Going to the definition of genocide, which is the topic that brings us all here, and the Shoah Foundation. It's I want to go like briefly on the definition of genocide because I think, along with other scholars, it's not that I came with this cool conclusion. I have been reading some books and I agree with them. So I think that the definition of genocide is deeply flawed and it has a lot of problems. And I find particularly two problems. One with the question of intent and one with the limited groups that are included under the definition or within the definition. So genocide is being defined as a series of acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, whether in times of peace or in times of war. So we see two things. We see intent and we see four categories, basically, of groups protected. First, I'll go to the groups protected. These are just four, as I mentioned before, just in the last slide. And when the Convention for the Prevention and the Punishment of the Crime of Genocide was drafted, if you see if you read the preparatory works of the convention, you can see that they decided that they were going to be stable and permanent groups. Those were going to be the ones who were going to be included. This meant that identity was not voluntary but ascribed. It was not that one person could change voluntarily from one to another. It was a category in which one was born, basically. However, so the membership is determined by birth, with the exclusion of more mobile groups, which one joins through individual or voluntary commitment. Three categories that I have seen that are excluded and I think that are the ones that I'm interested in, are political, social, and economic groups. It is kind of strange to see how this was conceived as identity not being voluntary but ascribed, because the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide was signed in December 1948, December 9 of 1948, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was ratified or was signed a day after that. And in that one, it said that religious and national identities could be exchangeable. So even though religious and national groups are considered stable and permanent groups in this convention, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, these actually can be changed. So this thing is actually questionable. For example, William Chavez has said, basically, that's where I'm taking his words, that the day after the General Assembly adopted the Genocide Convention, it approved the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which proclaims the fundamental right to change both nationality and religion, thereby recognizing that they are far from permanent and stable. Chavez explains that the national groups are modified dramatically as borders change and as individual and collective conceptions of identity evolve. Nationality may be changed, sometimes for large groups or individuals, where, for example, two countries have joined or secession has occurred, and religious groups may come into existence and disappear within a single lifetime. So, we can see that the exclusion of political, social, and economic groups is questionable. For example, people who are born in poverty how likely are they able to move? For example, people who are born as poor peasants in countries like El Salvador or as indigenous people in Guatemala, we have to question ourselves how much ascribed that identity is, or how stable and permanent that identity is actually. So that is basically the problem with the groups that were excluded. Basically, one explanation is that the drafters of the conventions were looking at past deeds and were trying to exclude groups that were going to be targeted in the future, because, for example, political groups. So that's why one of the definitions that I like about genocide is this one that came up from Kurt Jonassen and Frank Chuck, which says that genocide is a form of one-sided mass killing in which a state or other authority intends to destroy a group, as the group and the membership in it are defined by the perpetrator. So it's the perpetrator that defines what constitutes the outgroup and who is not in the group they belong to. So who considers the enemy? Because, and this kind of encompasses other groups that just for a legal technicality, which is the narrow definition of genocide, can be actually introduced in this crime of genocide. Sometimes I get asked why genocide and why not be comfortable with another definition like of what happened in El Salvador with scorched operations in Guatemala. Why not crimes against humanity, or why not war crimes? And when I have questioned this thing myself too. So, but thanks to the conference in Guatemala last session, I listened to a very important answer. And it was because I feel that there is an emotional charge that goes with the term of genocide. And that genocide means the annihilation not only of one people or several people, but the erasure of a social group from the face of the earth. And then one of the scholars that I was listening to at the conference on the Guatemalan genocide, she says that everything, it's about perceptions. And it's the perception that matters here, that it's not only, as I was saying, individual people that are being targeted, but social groups that want to be wiped out from the world, basically. So that's why, for me, it is important to call what happened both in El Salvador and Guatemala as a genocide, to understand or to have like a holistic experience of what it constitutes. So, another problem with the definition of genocide is the question of intent. The question of intent, actually, as we read the definition of genocide, it doesn't say that it requires a specific degree of intent. It just says with intent to destroy in whole or in part. However, the courts that have reviewed cases of genocide, as the ICTY and as the ICTR, have said that genocide requires a high degree of intent, which is dolus especialis. However, scholars do not feel so comfortable about this, including myself, which, as I told you before, I'm a lawyer and I have great respect for the law, but I think my mind is bending to the more historic side. So, in this case, and although crime of genocide has evolved by, we can say that it has been evolved by introducing the crime of genocide into the ICC statute. It was basically just copied and pasted to the ICC statute. However, and it says the same thing. It does not require a specific degree of intent. It just says with intent. However, in Article 30 of the ICC statute, it says that a person has intent. A person has intent where, in relation to a conduct, that person means to engage in the conduct, or in a relation to a consequence, that person means to cause that consequence, or he is aware that it will likely happen, that consequence. So that moves from a dolus specialis to a dolus generalis, which is a knowledge-based approach. I did not probably intended to cause a genocide, but I was aware that with my actions, that was the probably outcome that was going to happen. And for example, in the case of Guatemala, we have the documents from Operation Sofia about the dos R's. And although some people say that was not a Scorched operation or a genocidal practice, I consider that it was. But we have Operation Sofia, in which we can see clearly the intent of the army to eradicate and to kill that people and to wipe out the whole community. In El Salvador, it's not that easy to find those documents. At least not one document has been leaked to the press or to the public. However, so in order to have these cases tried, we have to look for these. We have to try to lessen the standard of intent and go to a knowledge-based approach, I think. However, since no case of the ICC statute of the ICC has been dealt with the crime of genocide so far, we don't know which type of intent or which kind of degree of intent they are going to apply. So, well, I have more here, but I'll conclude with this. So, I think it's important to go back to the original definition of genocide, which was how he said, a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of groups, with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. It's all about killing social groups. And I will end with a phrase that I heard on one of the testimonies that was very powerful from yesterday. It's a phrase from Dolores Balbina Maxis. She says, it didn't matter whether we were poor, whether we were peasants, whether we were Mayans, we were all people, and we all deserve peace. So I would like to end with that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paula. We have time for questions, so go.
Thank you for a very important presentation and very informative. My question, and I would like a comment or your reflections on this, is much like if people drink from a poisoned well and are killed, the legacy of that poisoned well still remains. In the case of genocide in Guatemala and El Salvador specifically, you have people that are targeted for their political or organizing beliefs for execution and extermination. The fundamental chaos left afterwards of that genocide is a society, a community, and a government in dysfunction. And I was wondering if you could comment on the legacy of genocide in both El Salvador and Guatemala as it results to the present day. As you know, and many of us are aware who have studied this and questioned this, we now have two countries, Guatemala and El Salvador, that are under traumatic stress as a result of MARA or criminal activities. And those criminal organizations commit many of the same acts that were perpetrated by governments on the right and military regimes in both Guatemala and El Salvador. I was wondering if you could comment on, or your thoughts and your studies are on the legacy of genocide and what happens afterwards and what it leaves in its wake.
Well, I would like to answer that by starting with the fact that the northern triangle of Central America, it's the most dangerous region in the world which is not at war. So, for example, El Salvador is the most violent country in the world with the largest toll of death per inhabitant. So we can see that it's a remnant basically of the impunity that was produced in the aftermath of the war in El Salvador. And I have heard this phrase from one victim of political violence in El Salvador who says that that person who kills one time and gets away with murder, it is more likely that that she will kill again. Because there's no deterrence from perpetrating these kinds of crimes. In the case of Guatemala, they enacted an amnesty law. And that amnesty law, we can say that it was not perfect, but it was not a blanket amnesty because it left some crimes outside the scope of the legal boundaries. However, in El Salvador, a blanket amnesty was enacted 5 days after the truth report was the report of the Truth Commission was released. And I wanted to point out to that actually because just in July 13 this year, the amnesty law was finally declared unconstitutional. And this is just like a self-promotion thing, but my father and I were the ones who drafted the lawsuits that came out with the result of declaring the amnesty law unconstitutional. So for the first time ever in 23 years, we're going to be able to see how the judicial system works or not in El Salvador. In Guatemala, we have seen that it has worked with its faults. It's not perfect, but with some great persons, just like Claudia Paz y Paz or Juez Barrios, we have seen that at least if Rios Montt is not tried again before he dies, at least he will die as a genocidaire, as a convicted genocidaire. That judgment was halted but was not revoked. So he is at least seen as one genocidaire, and some other cases are being taken to the Court of Justice, such as the massacre of Dos R's, or the case of Marco Antonio Molina Thyssen. So I think Guatemala is a step forward in the claims for justice than El Salvador. However, I think that in both cases, since there was a failed DDR process in both countries. So those people who were part of the guerrilla forces or for the army reinserted in society without even having a psychological evaluation, and when they didn't find a job, they resorted either to join the National Police Force or the organized crimes cells that are living and well alive and present in these kinds of countries. For example, I want to point out that I've interviewed one perpetrator. He was part, in El Salvador, he was part of immediate reaction battalion from the army. And what he does now, he's a police member. And he told me about all the atrocities that they perpetrated. And I asked him, have you ever received any psychological treatment oh, you know what, you want to know what was my psychological treatment? Was to go in a cell, all isolated, and to be punished for having a nervous breakdown. So that was their way. And I was also listening to another testimony from Guatemala, and this person was forced to be a member of the auto defense patrols, and now he is helping exhumations, processes of exhumations. So we can see how people have dealt with this kind of stress.
This is more a general question about your thoughts on theory of genocide, I suppose, than not really specific to El Salvador and Guatemala. You mentioned that you are happy that genocide is often considered to be a non-stable definition, one that is subject to the changes in history and necessarily has to consider historical demands. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the changing state of warfare in context of genocide, specifically what happens to definitions of intent when you have a blurring of the line between collateral damage and genocide, particularly with something like drone strikes, where you have governmental bodies who are drone striking regions where there are many different contingencies, many different groups of people, and there are huge civilian casualties. So I was wondering, as a legal scholar, what you would think might have to change in investigating intent. For instance, just sort of taking broadly Syria as an example, do you think that legal scholars and lawyers will have to begin investigating intent differently in that sense?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. That intent has to be lowered down to a lesser degree. Because if we go for the highest degree, which is dolus specialis, we are asking basically to go into the mind of perpetrator to see if his intent or his intention was really to commit genocide or not. And he can say, no, my intention was not to commit genocide. It was just collateral damage, for example. But with the knowledge-based approach, if you know that with your actions will cause, as a result, a genocide, this can actually be considered as that. For example, I was thinking about economic sanctions and how economic sanctions can become genocidal too. Because with the intention may not be to kill or to cause or to kill all the population. However, if you know that there's a starving population that is not getting any food, any water, any access to all these resources, then it can become genocidal. So, and especially, yes, I think it's hard to prove. And I just wanted to remember something that was said on the Guatemalan conference about the intent, but no, I don't remember. But yes, that's basically what I think about that.
Hi, I have a question about the economic results of the genocidal behavior in Guatemala and El Salvador. Did it result, say, in the abandonment of villages, destruction of records, so there was loss of traditional ownership? Was the land consolidated under the ownership of what you were saying, the 14 families or the ruling elites? Is basically what I'm asking is, does genocide have a result of transferring the resources of the eradicated population?
I have not think about that actually. Like, I have not analyzed the outcome, but for example, I was listening to one of the testimonies from Guatemala about how their houses were burned and how their everything that they have, they lost it, and how they had to fled to the mountains to flee to the mountains to actually have a life. And I was thinking about a book by James Scott, I don't remember the name, But he actually talks about societies that in the past used to like run away from the state and how these societies were not existing anymore. And when I was listening to the testimonies of the Guatemalan survivors, it was amazing to see how these people managed to survive in the jungle or in the forest, even for 14 years in a row. They learned how to eat from roots. They learned how to be almost naked because they didn't have any clothes. They learned a lot of new techniques that we can associate with the past, but it was incredible to hear how these people were actually managing with very few resources and how they came back to a place that it had nothing. For example, at the movie that the Shoah Foundation showed, Finding Oscar, one of the phrases that it struck me is that when they were taking the aerial pictures, the person who was the owner of the dwell in which they put a lot of people in to cover the crime, he said, not even the grass grows here. So it was just total desolation in those places. So that's basically yeah.
In light of what happened with how the amnesty was revoked, I think you said in
Yes.
El Salvador, largely thanks to something that you worked on. That's amazing.
Those were my 50 minutes of
That's
it.
amazing. So do you think then that what happened in Guatemala with the trials is a harbinger of what might be coming in for El Salvador?
Hopefully is what we are aiming for. But the government in turn right now, which is the former guerrilla movement, are not supporting the judicialization of these cases. They are saying basically what the right-wing party said for 20 years, that the amnesty was the cornerstone of the peace accords, and that the past is the past and should be left that way, and that nobody should be tried because that was an agreement that they reached. So basically impunity has been the discourse of both the right and the left in El Salvador. So actually in one of a recent interview that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs gave, he said that it was incredible, or that the people in El Salvador were showing how mature they are, because even though the law has been derogated or has been expelled from the judicial system, no one has filed a case yet. That's not true on the one hand, because there are a lot of cases, I can say approximately 40 cases, that are dormant in the judicial system and just need to be shaken a little bit. And because we, with my father and a legal team, we are going to prove that we are not mature enough. So we're going to file, we're going to file one case. We are just talking with the victims to see who is willing to take that quest for justice, basically.
Could it be that even though there is a leftist government right now in place in El Salvador, that they don't go ahead with it, not because they don't agree in their mind with the violation that took place, but because the right in El Salvador is so powerful, and the truth is that these governments in Latin America that lean a little bit toward the left are not that likable by the United States, so it's a way of at least having some power to be able to do some changes in El Salvador that otherwise might not take place there? This is a question.
I wish that would be the case, but it's not. I mean, the left government or the left-wing party have become the new rich in El Salvador. And they have abandoned basically all the principles that they were fighting for. They have been absorbed by the system right now. So what they are afraid of is that they might be subjected to trial because one of the results of the declaration of the amnesty law was that the 32 cases that are contained within the final report of the Truth Commission should go to trial. And both people from the right and people from the left are in that report because one of the highlights of the Truth Commission for El Salvador, it was that it named names. So they both want to avoid justice. It's from both sides. Yeah, I wish that was the case, but it's not.
So I know because I've talked to you about your research that you conducted interviews in El Salvador, like oral history interviews. And I want to ask you, because you're one of the few people that's watched these Guatemalan testimonies, I mean, other than the people who are indexing them and that collected them, what surprised you about the interviews, either in method or content? And what major lessons do you take away from having intensively watched these testimonies for the last month?
Yes, I think that it was, and this is just something that it struck me yesterday, that with these testimonies, I was able to take a break. I heard them for a while, then I went out to smoke a cigarette because I'm a smoker. Or drink a coffee or do something, so it was not constantly hearing them. I could take breaks. However, yesterday, with one testimony, I finally broke. So I was crying at the office. I thought somebody was watching at me like I was having something, because these are very powerful testimonies. And the way that they are conducted, they are very respectful of what people's thoughts are and what they want to say. And it's not, and one thing that is important for me that they are doing, and that I was trying to do with my own testimonies back in El Salvador, is to listen not to only the violent acts that they have victims of, but how was their life before that event, that traumatic event happened, and how they have managed to come forward or to survive to that type of heinous acts. So I think, and that is something that oral historian says, Alessandro Portelli, that you are not only interested in what actually the event was, but how life or how memories are recorded and how it has transformed the persons. And at the Guatemalan conference, Freddy Pecherelli was saying that it was important to see how when they remember their childhood, they could go back to memories that were like joyful for them. So you can see smiles from them before going back into tears. So I think that I found the testimonies amazing. Yeah, and yes, they have been excellent.
I have a question about your interviews that you yourself conducted in El Salvador. And I don't know if there is any way that the victims or the people who suffer this practice of Tierra Rosada afterwards are organized or came back together, or at least tell something about them claiming for their voices or rights.
Yeah, since I was looking at Scorched operations, but basically violence against women and girls, that's what I'm interested in, the Guatemalan testimonies on women, just a commercial. It's very difficult that these persons talk. Like, for example, some of the interviews that I got, some people told me, or either it's the first time that I'm saying this, or it's just you and the priest who knows, or it is you, my husband, my daughter, and me that know what happened. So, but there is like a sorority, I will say, among victims. because I was able to conduct my interview by this technique that it's called snowball sampling, because it was just one person who I interviewed and probably felt comfortable with the interview and said, oh, I know other people. So it was like a change that get me to get 49 interviews basically in several months. So yes, it's that, and I think that the social movement in El Salvador is right now not well structured, because the left-wing party, which now is the government, has co-opted all those movements and it's using them to their purposes, basically. For example, like in one of the cases, because I'm not looking, and that's something that I haven't come up with, the Guatemalan testimonies, that I'm not looking only at victims of violence from the state, but also from the guerrilla forces. And I tried to interview one person from the guerrilla forces, a woman, which has a high position, and she told me that she was not going to participate because I don't know how she found out what kind of questions I was making, and that I should leave the past as the past because that was forgotten, and that if I continue to do my interviews, I was giving instruments to the right-wing party to attack them. So, and that's something that I haven't seen in the Guatemalan testimonies. It has been just state-sponsored violence, but yeah. I'm in El Salvador right now. I was like really lucky, let's say, because I was able to get some testimonies of the perpetrators before the amnesty law was declared unconstitutional, because now no one will give me a testimony. So, because they know that they can face trials. So, before that, they felt that they were impugned. So,
I think we have time for one more question.
I mean, just responding to what you just last said, so on one hand, the lawyer actually defeated the historian, because in a way you got, you kind of robbed you or stole yourself resources you could actually have. So, but can you, since you conducted these interviews and you saw the Guatemalan ones, do you see any differences? I mean, you were looking for similarities, but maybe you can tell us a little bit of what you see as differences. Not so much about the method of the interviews, but more about the content. Where did you find any?
well, one of the differences that I was mentioning is that I haven't found any testimonies about victims from the guerrilla forces. That actually they have said that they were protected by the guerrilla forces. Sometimes in one of the testimonies, like people felt like after Scorched operations, when the people repopulated the area, in the case of Guatemala, like they didn't want some of the people who returned because they thought that they were guerrilla forces, and because of them, the army had attacked them. But it was not the guerrilla who actually attacked them. So that was a little bit different from the testimonies that I heard from El Salvador. And in terms of scorched operations, like the practices, I haven't found any like a striking difference that I can recall right now. In terms of the methods of, and even yesterday I was listening to a testimony about a woman who got raped, I think I mentioned it, by the security forces, and it was so similar to one testimony that I conducted with one of the persons in El Salvador. So, I mean, they were both trained at the School of the Americas, so they both have the same education or background to perpetrate these kinds of atrocities. What might have differed is how the guerrilla did not attack their own populations.
Do you have also forced recruitment in these areas, like in Guatemala, like with the Autodefense Patrol?
Yes. I have one testimony that I listened to that he was forcibly recruited.
No, but I mean in El Salvador. Do you have a similar phenomenon of this kind of patrols?
No. They were not. I mean, there were groups that, the groups of peasants that were like the vigilantes in the area, and there was forced recruitment from both sides actually in Salvador. Yeah. But what can we say is it's forced recruitment from the side of the guerrilla when your whole family has been massacred by the army, and then you're the only one left, and then your only one family becomes the guerrilla forces. So, yeah, how much can we talk about forced recruitment in that case? And I heard in both in testimonies in Guatemala and El Salvador the same thing, that they were left only with the guerrilla, and that was it. And they took them in as part of the group.
Thank you so much.